Elle, it's Dr. Wright. So we just finished week 2, and there were a lot of questions from students in the reflections for Unit 2, asking about how do we decide which research method do we use. And I wrote a little bit about it in the Unit 3 weekly email to give you some ideas about that. So I wanted to kind of go through a research question with you, and so you could kind of see the process of how would we actually do this research study? How would we come up with what we wanted to do? So let's say that we wanted to know, um, there's so many good questions out there. We wanted to know how the death of a pet impacts children's um, impacts children. Speaking of pets, I've got a little cat right here. Impacts children and their grieving. Okay, so that's our research question. So, how does the death of a pet impact children and their grieving? So, with my research question, I can start to come up with how would I want to gather my data. So, one thing that I could do is I could interview children and their parents, because remember, if the participant is under 18, we need parental consent in order to do the informed consent procedure. So if I wanted to do interviews, which would be a qualitative research methodology, and then I wanted to ask each child the same set of questions, and then analyze that verbal data, that's one strategy that I could do. So a lot of times when we first start thinking about this, we get kind of overwhelmed with all of the possibilities. So the first strategy that we might do is we might go through the articles relating to our topic to see how other people have gathered this data. And there's more animals, if you can't hear the barking. So we would look through the research literature and we would say, okay, so who else has studied this? How have they studied it? What have they found so far? Did they use a survey? If they used a survey, which survey did they use? Is my question a little bit different than the researchers that I'm finding? And if so, can I use the same method that they did? But just update it or change it a little bit. So with our research questions, so let's say that we go into the literature and we find that there is data indicating that, small children, so between 3 and 6, feel guilty in their loss of a pet because they think that they should have done something different, regardless of how the pet died. And then older children may go through typical stages of grief. Um, and so we then want to think to ourselves, okay, how do we want to change our research question a little bit? So we're focusing specifically on a particular age group. So do we want to focus on, 3 to 6? Do we want to focus on 6 to 9, things like that? And reviewing the literature can really help us to figure out, how do we need to make our question more specific so that we can then create that very specific testable hypothesis. Now, I will say that when we're doing qualitative research, so, how does this work or how do people feel about this? We may not have a particular hypothesis because we just want to go out and gather data. So verbal data or journal entry data, so written data from our participants. So we may not have a direction or a hypothesis. We just want to know, what's going on with this. So we might decide that we want to study 3 to 6-year-olds. So one strategy that we could do is we could bring them into a laboratory. And first, we would need to obviously find participants who have experienced the loss of a pet and who are between the required age group. And so we would want to probably do some advertising or maybe use social media to find possible participants. And if we're going to do a laboratory study, we're going to bring them into the lab, then we would want to have local participants as opposed to if we're doing like an online survey or something like that, then we could have, participants from across the globe. So I've decided that I want to do my method that I want to do is I want to have them come into the lab and I want them to draw a picture of how they feel about their loss experience with their pet. So again, this sort of data would probably be more qualitative as opposed to quantitative. And so if we're, thinking that we want to ask questions and look at themes, then we would either want to do maybe a online survey where participants can answer the questions in their own words. Or, we could bring them into a laboratory and have them do it that way. Another thing we want to think about is the ethics of performing our research study. So if it's possible that having our participants come in and think about the loss of their pet could re-traumatize them or re-upset them about the pet, we would have to put that information into the informed consent document for the parents, and the parents would have to make the choice of, do I want to potentially re-expose my child to this traumatic event? And then also we would include that information in our institutional review board request for approval to be able to do the study. So ethics is really going to impact the kind of choice of method. So let's say that I want to study the impact of child abuse. Obviously, I can't do an experimental study for that. I can't, put people into one group that's going to be abused and one group that's not going to be abused. It's just not ethical. So there's some questions that may be limited to specific types of methods because of the potential ethical issues of a research study. So all of these things are going to kind of maybe pare down the potential options that we can have in terms of doing the research study that we want to do. So we may also think about, is the presence of a researcher potentially going to impact the results from a participant? If they are, is it possible for us to do the research study completely through computer, where there's no researcher, there's no everyone gets the same instructions, so there's no priming, there's nothing, there's no demand characteristics that are going to impact how the student or how the participant is going to answer. So we may think about, should we do an online survey? We also may want to do an online survey if our goal is to have participants from across the United States or across the globe, things like that. So a lot of the decisions that you're making about the data that you want to gather are going to kind of funnel you into a specific direction or method of what's ethical, what's possible. So we also may think about financial concerns. So typically surveys, especially online surveys, are financially easier to do than, say, an experimental study where we have to bring participants into the lab and we have to use some sort of resource that costs money. So We also want to think about, longitudinal studies, studies where we study the same group over time, can be expensive in terms of keeping up with all of the participants. And, depending upon the length of time that we're doing this study, it's quite possible that the researcher themselves may leave the institution, may pass away. There's lots of possible things that could happen during, a 10-year study. So those are all things we want to take into consideration as we're trying to figure out the best strategy to do our method. So some students asked, is there a wrong method? And I wouldn't say there's a wrong method, but I would say that there's definitely challenges and benefits to each method. And so you want to pick the one that has the most benefits and the least drawbacks for the answer to the research question that you're answering. So I hope that helps to give you some more understanding of which research methods you would choose. And also keep in mind, if you are a psychology major, you're going to take a course called Research Methods. And during that class, you'll talk more about each method um, in detail, and that you will be given some guidelines and some, instructions in terms of which one to choose and why. So I hope that helps answer your questions. If you still have more questions about research methods, feel free to either post them as a comment to this video on YouTube or to send me a message via Canvas inbox. Thanks.